So today is August the 18th, 2021. I'm Bernie Herman, and I'm here with Heather Terry Lusk and Pete Terry of Willis Wharf and Quinby, respectively, but really Willis Wharf. And this is part of our series, Conversations in the Kitchen. Great. So Pete, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your family and how they came to Willis Wharf?
Sure. My great-grandfather, Charles Floyd Terry, owned a clipper ship out of Sayville, Long Island, and he was one of the founders of United Fruit Company. 3 times a year he would sail from Long Island to South America and pick up tropical fruits and bring them back and sell them into the cities. On the times when he was at sea and he wasn't going to South America, he would come down to the Chesapeake Bay and to the seaside of the Eastern Shore and pick up seed oysters and take them up and plant them in Great South Bay. At the time, Great South Bay was one of the most prolific oyster areas in the entire world, and he would sell the seed oysters to Blue Point Oyster Company, and they would plant them and then harvest them in a year's time and run them through the shucking house up there. They were able to sail out of that area because it had such a wide inlet, and in the hurricane of 1938, that inlet closed off and Fire Island was formed, and South Bay went downhill after that. The oyster business went downhill in Long Island after that period, and you know, it's kind of neat that when Sandy went through, it opened that inlet back up. And now South Bay is a prolific oyster area again. But when my grandfather was in high school, he was a little LD, and he didn't perform as well in school as his sister. And my great-grandfather gave him an option of either getting straight A's or coming on the boat with him, and he did not get straight A's, and so he went aboard the boat with my great-grandfather, and on his first trip south, they went over to New Haven, Connecticut, and shanghaied some crew out of a bar, and sailed to South America and back, and he was very unhappy with that lifestyle. And on their next trip, they came into the Machiponga River, Willis's Wharf, and bought a load of seed oysters from Hezekiah Westcott, who ended up being my great uncle. So my grandfather and my great grandfather were sailing, and in those days they loaded the oysters in nets over the side of the sailing ship, and as the ship rocked in the ocean, the oysters would dip and they keep them from drying out. And they got off of the Delaware Bay, and a storm was coming, and my great-grandfather was warned to go into the bay for protection. He thought he could outrun the storm, and he didn't. So in order to save the ship, he sent my grandfather over the side of the ship with an axe to cut the net. And he said at that point he didn't have a stitch of clothes on him that wasn't torn from the oysters. And he decided that was his last trip. He kind of fell in love with the Eastern Shore. So after they got back to New York, he apprenticed himself to his uncle, who was a carpenter, and he became a master builder. But he always wanted to come back down to the Eastern Shore, and after he got his builder's license, he came back to the Eastern Shore, and for a while he grew seed oysters for Blue Point with Uncle Hezekiah, and through Uncle Hezekiah he met my grandmother. Then they settled here, and he started his oyster business in 1903.
And you were raised in the oyster business?
I was raised in the oyster business, yes.
Could you talk about that as a kind of school or a system of education?
Well, I'm the middle of 3 boys. you know, and so I suffer from the middle child syndrome, where the father takes the oldest and the mother has to protect the youngest, and the middle child is sort of fending for themselves. Not really a true story, but it sounds good. But I was fortunate that my uncle, who was in the oyster business with my dad, and they were partners, lived next door, and he had 2 daughters. So I became his prodigal son. And his part of the operation was the production side, working on the water, repairing the boats, growing the oysters, dredging oysters and bring them into the shucking house. My dad's job was to see that they were shucked and taking care of the sales in. So I ended up with my uncle. And so I grew up on the water, working with him, and he was quite a naturalist. He had a great eye for different things on the water that were of interest. And so I grew up not only with a great curiosity about the seaside and the water and things around me, but I was able to observe things going on, and you know, I just fell in love with it. I later went to Virginia Tech, and then I served in special warfare in the Navy through the Vietnam War, and came back after the service and went to work for Steak and Ale Restaurant Corporation, running restaurants in Baltimore and Philadelphia and up in New Jersey. And I just finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I came back and went into the oyster business with my dad and uncle, and then my younger brother decided that he also wanted to come back, and so it started. We started out with kind of like my dad and uncle. My brother was in the packing room and doing the sales, and I was in the bay with my uncle. And in 1984, 85, oyster disease struck, and all the oysters all the oysters died. We had 60,000 bushels of oysters planted, and within 4 weeks they were all dead. The meat was running right out of the shells. So we went through a financial hard time for a couple of years, and we had started growing a few clams at that time because they seemed to be able to grow. And Tom Walker, who was one of the other big oyster companies in Willis's Wharf, J.C. Walker Brothers, asked us to join them in a clam venture, which we did, and it all turned out to be fairly successful.
I believe that we are now the largest clam producing area in the world.
Willis Wharf is the largest clam producing, hatchery producing area in the world. And Hog Island Bay and the lower Chesapeake Bay are probably the highest volume clam areas in the world, and they were all the production basically comes from the 3 large shucking operations that started in Willis's Wharf, and they're all over 120 years old. It's pretty exciting.
So one of those is H.M. Terry, one of them is Walker Brothers.
J.C. Walker Brothers, and the other's Cherrystone Aqua Farms, which before that was Ballard Brothers.
Now when you say your uncle, do you mean your Uncle Buzz?
Uncle Buzz, yes.
Okay. Before we go more into that, tell us about your being here, and obviously you were born here, but...
Yep, I was born here, raised in Willis Wharf. Also grew up working for the family business. By the time I started working there, we were really just only growing clams. And so I grew up working for the business, you know, riding my bike to the oyster house, playing in the mud. Then I also went to school at Virginia Tech. I went to law school, and I spent some years working in securities law in New York, which is definitely a different path than aquaculture. But after a few years, my husband and I, my husband is also from the Eastern Shore, and his family is in the seafood business as well. We decided to move back here, and I went back to work for H.M. Terry Company.
So Pete, I was wondering if you might walk us through the cultivation of an oyster. You start with a lease ground, and how do we get from that to oysters in the marketplace?
It's a miracle. Well, oysters are gregarious animals, and they tend to reproduce in the wild by releasing the egg and sperm into the water column, and it's triggered by an ammonia compound in the male that signals the female that there's sperm in the water, and she releases the eggs in the water column, and the oysters become free-swimming larvae for 14 to 21 days, and then they start to develop their own shell, and then they find something to latch onto, and they stay there. And in the old days, when my grandfather and my dad and uncle were growing oysters, we would save the shells from all the shuck product, and every spring we'd take those shells and we'd put them back overboard on seed rocks. The young oysters would strike, and a year later we'd take those oysters up and we'd move them out near the ocean and spread them out to grow. We'd leave them there for 2 years, and then we'd dredge them up and run them through the oyster house and save the shells, and the next year we'd repeat that cycle. It was farming oysters of a not intensive farming like we do in aquaculture today, but it was still farming. When all the oysters died, then Stan Allen and his group from Rutgers developed a Triploid Oyster, which basically is an oyster with an extra chromosome, so it can't reproduce. And these oysters don't spend their summer reproducing. An oyster, when it reproduces, and they'll reproduce twice a year if the conditions are right, will expand about 80% of their body weight in reproduction. And during that time, they don't grow. And they're very, very poor, which is why nobody ate oysters in months that didn't have R's in them, because it wasn't so much that they were dangerous to eat, in that they were just so poor they weren't worth eating, and they were all water. So when they developed the Triploid oyster, it's an oyster, because it didn't go through reproduction, it grew all year. And we were able to learn to grow it off the bottom, so it grew fast enough that it reached market size before disease could kill it. And so Virginia stayed in the oyster business. Then the native oyster, because the disease, the Perkinses, was a virus. You know, nothing, you can't develop an immunity to virus, but you can develop a resistance, just like a common cold. Some people get very sick. Some people get the sniffles a couple of days and it's all gone. So oysters are the same way, and over the last 30 years they've developed a resistance, and the natural oysters have made a huge comeback, especially on the seaside. But now we have a combination of both aquacultured oysters and wild oysters.
So the oysters are caught up, but now they are farmed in cages or in bags. What system do you use?
Well, we use cages. Honestly, we don't do a lot of oysters anymore. We have people that grow oysters for us. We supply the seed, which is kind of Heather's end of the deal, in our oyster operation. And we grow maybe 4 million, 5 million oysters a year. We have in recent years, we've started planting shells back to get natural strikes, both on the seaside and in Nassawadox Creek. We've had, I'd say we've had really good success so far. The wild oysters we will sell as, wild oysters, and we'll run them through our shucking house. And the aquacultured oysters, we box for mostly restaurant and retail sales.
So I want to come to two questions. One would be for Heather, which is, how does the seed business work? I mean, where do you get these things? And then I was wondering, Pete, if you could walk us through how a shucking house works now, and they were quite different 50 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
So if we could get both sides of that story, that would be great.
Okay.
So for clam seed, we have our own hatchery, and so we spawn and raise our own clams. For us in particular, we keep everything that we spawn. So our hatchery doesn't sell clam seed, although there are hatcheries that spawn seed just for that purpose, just to sell it. And so we don't spawn our own oysters, though. So that seed is seed that we buy. There are multiple. We buy only oyster seed from Virginia. There are multiple hatcheries in Virginia that sell oyster seed. Cherrystone Aqua Farms has a clam hatchery and an oyster hatchery. So we get some of our seed from them. There's a couple of hatcheries on the western shore that spawn oysters and sell seed. And it's interesting because at this point, you can sort of shop for oysters and oyster seed. There are different varieties that are spawned to be successful in different salinities. There are oysters that they've been selectively bred to be disease resistant, to be faster growers. So it's very interesting. So different hatcheries have their own lines, and so you can almost sort of pick and choose which oysters you want. So I generally in the wintertime start deciding how many oysters are we going to grow, which oysters do we want to get, and then I bring that seed in and we put it in it's called a flupsy. It's hard to describe. It's a floating upweller system. And I grow that seed up until it's big enough to go into the 4 millimeter bag, and then we disperse it and put it out. So that's kind of how that process works.
Okay. So the folks who are growing for you, it's almost sort of like renting a farm?
Sort of. Well, no, I wouldn't say it's like renting a farm. They're taking the seed and growing it out on their ground, and then bringing it back to us. And
as
then
fully mature.
Yes, and then we do the finishing, and off they go.
Okay, so I have two questions now.
Yes.
One is, we use the word seed a lot, and I don't think a lot of people outside of the oyster world would know what that means. So could you describe what seed is?
Yes, so oyster seed and clam seeds are not actually seeds. They're baby animals. So they're baby oysters, baby clams, juvenile animals. So they are actually living animals.
And how big are they?
I mean, they range, but when I get oyster seed, for instance, it's half the size of my pinky nail. It's very small, big enough to not fall through a micron screen, but pretty small. Not always big. I mean, big enough to see individual animals, but quite small. As small as a seed.
Okay. So you're actually bringing in these tiny animals, and they're going through this system of graduated bags and and then ultimately into cages. So what about the finishing end of the process?
So we're selling a seaside oyster. That's our family business. So
And delicious, I might add.
and delicious. So we finish the oysters on the seaside. And it doesn't take long for an oyster to assume the characteristics of its surroundings, and so that's how we get that seaside flavor.
Part of that is that sometimes oysters are grown out to a point on the bay side and then move to the seaside. Why do you start on the bay side and move to the seaside?
You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but in general, that's because the oyster strike, the wild oyster strike on the seaside, can be so prolific that it'll foul up the gear in a hurry, and so it is much less labor intensive to grow the oysters out on the bay side. They grow well, but you don't have quite the oyster strike, and the areas are generally more protected.
One of the key points that you bring up is that an oyster is essentially a liquid animal, and that wherever you put it, it's going to taste exactly like where it came from. And so you all are very careful about picking and choosing where oysters are grown and finished?
We try to be. An oyster's flavor profile is going to be basically based on the salinity of the water and what it feeds on. At different times of year, wherever you're growing the animal, depending on salinity and temperature, you get different algae in the water. And oysters feed on one-celled one-celled plants. So depending on what plant is in the water at the time, gives you your flavor profile of the oyster. And of course, the salinity on the seaside being somewhere between 30 and 34 parts per thousand, it's a much saltier animal. So, basically goes a lot better with beer.
Well, many things do.
Exactly.
Could you walk us through a packing house operation? A shucking house and packing house?
Well, I'll try to. That's really never been my forte, but at one time, we had 80 shuckers when my grandfather was running it. And they'd come in at 3 o'clock in the morning and shuck until the 300 or 400 bushels of oysters were gone. And then, and this was a 5-day-a-week operation. That's, that's a thing of the past. People always thought that shucking oysters was an unskilled job, but it's not. It's very skilled. The people that are good at it have very good hand-eye coordination and great dexterity. There's two ways to shuck an oyster. The way that we always used on the seaside, because the oyster shell was so thin, was what they call breakers, where you'd break the tip of the oyster off with a hammer and then go in through the front and cut the muscle and go that way. The people that mostly shucked bayside oysters, which was a thicker shelled oyster, were called stabbers, and they'd either go through the hinge or go through the side of the oyster and shuck it that way. We still shuck oysters, and we shuck both bayside and seaside, depending on the time of the year and what we can get. We only have 6 to 8 shuckers max. We have 2 older shuckers that have been with us 40 years maybe, and I think we'll end up bringing them in wheelchairs because they just like to do it. We have some young Hispanic shuckers that Eddie Bell, who runs their packing facility, is trained. They're very good, but it's hard to find, especially with the hourly rate in today. It's hard to find somebody that wants to come in and stay in there and shuck oysters all day. But we basically bring the oysters in and we let them sit overnight, and this gels the liquid up and allows the oyster to absorb the liquor in the shell. And then we lay them out on the tables in front of the shuckers, and they'll either break them or stab them and put the oyster in a chilled bucket. And the shells go down into a conveyor and go out on the outside, and we'll save the shells. And then they after they get a bucket full, which is about a gallon and a quarter, they dump it on a skimming table, and they go through and wash them and pick the shell out, and rinse them off, and then we pack them in gallon buckets and off they go.
So do most of them go to the north, or?
They go all over. We don't shuck enough to have big retail chains. I don't think we really want to. We sell some small retailers locally. We sell to some repackers across the bay. They take them and pack them in their jars, sell them to local restaurants.
So I have two questions about this. First of all, could you describe the difference between washed and unwashed oysters?
Well, an unwashed oyster is just an oyster that you dump on the skimming table, pick the shell out, don't use fresh water on it, put it, and it still retains the the salt and the grit and whatever that's in the oyster, and that's kind of hard to get away with that with the health department today. I mean, you can do special orders, but we don't do that very often. A washed oyster is something that you rinse off, and a lot of times you put them in what they call a blower tank, which a big tank of water, and you blow air up through the bottom of them, and that gets the grit and the shell out even more so than rinsing them. But it also takes a lot of the flavor out. And most people local people don't really want that oyster. But when you're selling to a grocery chain, you pretty much have to do that.
Is it true that the shelf life of a washed oyster is longer than an unwashed one?
I don't know that's true. The shelf life of a seaside oyster is probably 5 to 7 days longer than a bayside oyster. That has more to do with salinity than anything else. My grandfather sold all his oysters to Davenport Oyster Canning Company in Davenport, Iowa. And the reason that they particularly wanted his oyster is simply because of the salinity gave them an extra 4 or 5 days of shelf life, and we would send them out there by 5-gallon containers or gallon containers, and they'd repack them for the A&P grocery chains out there. But I don't think many people do that anymore.
So the other thing I was going to ask you along these lines is, could you talk about who the oyster shuckers were and how it was actually, if you were to describe an oyster shucking house in full operation in the old days, what was that like?
Well, again, that was never my area of operation. I didn't spend much time in the shucking house, except after they were finished shucking, we'd come back after school and roll the shells out. But from my memory, there was a lot of singing, and I think that had to do with occupying everyone's minds, but it also had to do with the rhythm of shucking, and mostly old gospels, because most of our shuckers were black people from the shore. and they'd start singing gospels and rock. And as they were rocking, they got in a rhythm of breaking and shucking, and I think it helped them pass the time, and also it increased the speed. It was actually quite lovely. Some really, really strong voices. But I don't really, except for that, I don't really have a great recollection of the shucking operation. But it was basically the same thing. They would shuck, shells would go on the floor, and when they got their container, they would take it up to the window, and they would dump it, and the guy would mark on a sheet how many oysters that they brought up, and then they would dump it in the blowing tanks, and when the tanks were full, they'd dump it on a skimming table and then pack it in gallons or pints or whatever they were doing at the time.
But you spent a lot of time working on the oyster grounds.
I did.
A lifetime, and in particular with your Uncle Buzz. Can you talk about that? And I know that your Uncle Buzz was a great personality.
He was a character. He was. He was also a middle child, which caused us to have a great affinity for one another. And he was a PBY pilot in the Navy in World War II, and he could sit down and start. He an amazing storyteller. He could sit down and start telling a story about one of his adventures flying a PBY, and end up talking about taking a couple loads of seed oysters to Chincoteague, and talk about duck hunting on Hog Island, and then come right back to the PBY story and never miss a beat, and it all sort of fit together. I was in awe of that. Somebody that's a great storyteller just has a gift. And I could just sit there and listen to him tell one story after another all day long. But we had breaks in between shoveling oysters and picking up oysters and working on the boats. But growing up with Uncle Buzz on the seaside was pretty much could have been every kid's dream. It was a wonderful experience.
Now, as I recall, your grandfather had words of caution about getting into the oyster business for your Uncle Buzz.
Well, Uncle Buzz when he came out of the Navy, he had a job offer with American Airlines, and I think he very much wanted to fly. My grandfather was petrified of airplanes, as was my father. And he offered my uncle partnership in the oyster company if he would promise that he wouldn't take a job with American Airlines. And I think he hemmed and hawed, but he finally decided that he'd come back and go in the oyster business with my grandfather and my dad. And so he was in the oyster business, and one day he came to my grandfather and he said, "Dad, what do you think about growing a few oysters on my own?" And my grandfather said, "Well, what do you have in mind?" He said, "Well, Rufus Dyes has some ground in Plantation Creek, and he knows where he can get his hands on some young seed oysters. If I can put up $500, we can grow 10,000 bushels of oysters. And when they're ready, well, then we can take them up and run them through the oyster house." And my grandfather says, "Absolutely. Absolutely do it. Write him a check today. Don't wait." And so my uncle said, "Well, Dad, why are you so anxious for me to be in the business?" And he said, "Well, son, in every man's life, there's certain things that he just absolutely has to experience. And one of those is getting involved in growing oysters with someone else. And I encourage you to do it just as fast as you can." So he did it. And so he wrote Rufus a check for $500. And Rufus planted the oysters in Plantation Creek. And the next year, Uncle Buzz said, "Rufus, how are those oysters doing?" "Buzz," He said, they're growing a flying. They're growing a flying. He says, every single one of them, bigger than a 50-cent piece. He said, they're going to take up, they're going to take up great. We're going to make a lot of money. Uncle Buzz says, that'd be great. That's great. So let another year go by, and the next year they were 2 years old. And he went by Rufus in early September. He said, Rufus, how are those oysters? He said, every one of them live to the oyster. He said, Dad, he said, I don't know if I've ever seen anything look that good. Uncle Buzz said, well, maybe we better take them up and run them through the house. He said, Buzz, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's a good idea. He said, I think if we wait until maybe Thanksgiving, he said, I bet every one of those oysters take up for a select. We make a lot of money on those, Buzz. I think we ought to wait. Uncle Buzz said, all right, I think so. That sounds like a good idea. So he waited till right around Thanksgiving. And he went to see Rufus, and he said, Rufus, are we ready to go with those oysters? Gosh dang, Buzz. Gosh dang, you won't believe it. He said, screwbores got into those oysters, killed them to the oyster. He said, I've never seen anything like it. My grandfather said, see, son, that's why I encouraged you to get in the oyster business with someone else. Now you've learned. It's a cheap lesson.
So you enjoyed being out there with your Uncle Buzz, and
I did, and we would stick up oyster ground for planting. We'd plant oysters, and then in our spare time, we'd go get oysters off the rocks and sell basket oysters. We'd go clamming, wading clams in the summer, signing clams in the winter. And when we weren't doing that, we were shooting marsh hens and shooting ducks. It was a very active life, and he really enjoyed being outside, and so did I. And it was a good relationship.
great. And you've spent no small amount of time out on the grounds,
That's true.
but you go out with your dad. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I grew up going out with my dad. You know, when I was coming up, we were not really so much in the oyster business as in the clam business. And so he would take me out to the clam ground, like if there was, you know, something that I wanted to buy or something that I was saving money for, we would go, and he would say, okay, we'll go pick up some clams. So we would go signing for clams, and that was a way to earn money for whatever sort of thing that I wanted. And then when I would come home from college, I would do some of that, or then he would be busy, so sometimes he sent me with some of the other watermen in Willis Wharf, and so I spent actually a lot of time on the clam flats with Ricky Bradford, which is a whole nother experience, but was a lot of fun and interesting. So yeah, I spent a lot of time doing those things, and now I don't. I'm not out as often as my dad is, or as Rich, my cousin, who is also working in the business, spends most of his time on the water. But in the summer, when we're planting seed, I'm out, and you know, occasionally other times in the year.
Okay. So you would be out there today.
He would be out there too.
Yes, if I wasn't here with you.
And what would you be doing out there?
Well, right now we're transplanting clam seed. We grow it up in the summer, and the idea with clam seed is to plant it in as dense a bed as you can get away with, so you have fewer beds to tend to until you plant it out to its final grow out. So we're coming from our summer nets into our winter nets, and then we'll take those clams up again in the spring and put them in their final grow out beds.
Now, the clam business is a parallel but different story, and this is one where the clams all but vanished, and that you and others actually figured out the way in which to grow out seed clams. Is that correct?
That is correct. When the Perkinses hit here, Perkinses has always been prevalent in southern oysters, and in the old days when they had oyster years here where we didn't have enough oysters to go around for the shucking houses to plant, they'd buy seed oysters out of South Carolina, and that would come up here with a Perkinsus virus in them, but it never lived here, and nobody really knew why. Harvey Boyne, who was one of the shucking houses here, always said that the water here was too pristine to establish a colony. The Perkinsus virus that actually killed the oyster here actually came out of the James River, and somehow that was an incubated area and produced a super virus. The virus mutated, and it was a lot stronger than the virus that was in the southern oysters. And previously, what hadn't killed the oysters killed them. And Bim said that that particular virus wouldn't affect, or didn't seem to affect, clams, but this one did. This one was strong enough that it pretty much wiped out the clam population up and down the seaside. But the clam recruitment has been very slow to come back compared to the oysters, and don't really know whether it's a case of too much predation, whether the clam was not as resilient as the oyster, but the clams have been very, very slow to come back, and what was once a very, very strong industry, the wild clam industry on the eastern shore, has pretty much dwindled to nothing. And in its place, I think that we've developed a pretty substantial clam industry. I don't understand why, with all the clams that we plant, there isn't enough recruitment to bring the wild clams back, but we're only now beginning to see some increase in the wild population. Hopefully it'll come back, because that's an industry that was very, very strong here. And the one thing we need here is more industry. But when I was a kid, there were 6 to 8 clam houses along the waterfront, buying wild clams from excuse me, from the clammers, and clammers sustained themselves over the summer with clams, and then they would harvest the oysters in the winter, and it was a year-round occupation. When all the oysters and the clams died, and that was the end of the industry itself, and we lost a lot of really good watermen. And we didn't have any of the younger generation coming back because there was no way to make a living doing it.
So talk about, please, the invention of the first prototypes that for clam reproduction that you all developed.
Well, and when you say reproduction, they've been spawning clams since World War II. The spawning the animal wasn't really a hard thing to do. You could do that in a bathtub. Spawning them on demand is something that was developed a little bit later on, but the process of spawning is nothing more than warming the water up and letting the clams go. The hard part was, after the clams were big enough to put in the wild, protecting them from predation. Mike Castagna at BIMS was on the forefront, and John Crowder also, on the forefront of developing that industry. And when I first came back into the seafood business with my dad and uncle, I did a lot of work with Mike, experimenting with different methods to protect. Mike finally found a plastic net on the West Coast that they used to protect shellfish out there, and we experimented with that, and it seemed to it seemed to really help. And then Tom Walker and myself, along with Mark Wallace and Tom Gallivan, took that net and we used it in different ways to try to determine faster ways to grow a clam out, and ways that we can get it out of the hatchery system where we're using a lot of electric running pumps, and put it into nature to let nature do the work for us. It was a system that we developed over 4 or 5 years, and put Virginia, I think, at the forefront of the shellfish industry. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on that because some of that is proprietary, and I don't want to get everybody throwing rotten tomatoes at me.
No. I don't think most folks have any idea about the scale of clam aqua farming. You say try to get them to grow close together. Can you just talk about the scale?
Well, it's pretty interesting. We probably produce somewhere around 350 million seed clams every year. And we grow them in a lot of different densities in order to get them to market size. But at the end of the day, we put about 45 to 50,000 clams under a 12 by 60-foot net. And our yield is maybe 35,000 clams a net. I think that the walkers are similar. I'm not sure the ballards may do a few more. They certainly do most of the clams, or most of the oysters. We've developed this from nothing to a $70–80 million a year industry. So the scale of the industry is quite substantial.
Yes, the physical scale is to be out there on the grounds and realize that almost to the horizon are these clams that nobody ever sees because they're under the water, they're under these nets. And that when clams are taken up, it's the count per net. And so somebody doesn't say, okay, I'm going to go out and get 30,000 clams. They go out and say, I'm going to pull 3 nets today and get 100,000, something like that. So that just the quantity of what's moving is really quite extraordinary.
It's amazing, yes it is.
So I want to ask you both about Willis Wharf. So far we've been dealing with shellfish, but Willis Wharf is a wonderful place that has changed a lot, particularly in light of aquaculture and what happened with the decimation of the natural oyster and clam beds. So could you all talk a bit about Willis Wharf and the community of water people who live there?
Well, Willis Wharf was a unique place. When I was growing up, Uncle Buzz always said that Willis Wharf drew characters like a dumpster drew cats. And I think that's pretty much true. We had a wide range of intellectuals, drunks, and they were all from top to bottom intermingled in a very close-knit society. A large portion, when I was growing up, a large portion of the people that lived in Willis Wharf actually moved off of Hog Island after the hurricane of 1933. And as in any small community, there was always family tiffs going on, which was interesting. There were 4 shucking houses in Willis's Wharf. We had one, the Walkers had one, the Ballards had one, and Harvey Boyne had one. And on any given day, there was probably 300 or 400 shuckers in and out of town, there were 3 stores. And in those days, you didn't pay by check, you paid by chit. And during the week, the shuckers would go to either Ballard's store or Johnson's store or Dowdy's store, depending on which one of the oyster houses those stores were hooked up with. The shuckers would buy their weekly groceries and supplies from those stores, and at the end of the week, they'd take their chit to whatever store they were buying from, and they would take whatever was owed, the store would take whatever was owed out of the check and give them cash in return. And that's the way the system worked. And so you had a payroll account, and then you had a regular account. And all 3 of those stores were very, very busy. They sold everything from clam picks to bologna and cheese and soft drinks and hardware. I mean, they were the old-timey general store. We dealt with the Johnson store. Mr. Johnson he was part of the Willis family. The store now is E.L. Willis. It was a restaurant for a while, but it's closed. But the entire waterfront was full of boats, and when I was coming along, the outboard motor was just being developed. And about the biggest motor in town was a 33 1/3 Evinrude. Everything else would go from a 5-horse Buccaneer right on up to a 20-horse Scott Atwater. None of those brands are even made today. But the little 5-horse Buccaneer, you could turn it around in a circle. It didn't have a reverse. You just turned the motor backwards and you went reverse. A lot of the people who worked on the water would catch a ride with a bigger boat, get towed out, and then they would pole to where they were going to work, or they would scull, which was you'd have an oar in the back of the boat, and you'd work it back and forth and give the boat forward motion. Or they had rowboats, and if you didn't have a ride out, you'd catch the tide. And it was a very, very slow lifestyle. And people would come down from Chincoteague, people would go out of Willis Wharf, they'd they'd spend the night, work 3 or 4 days, save whatever they were doing, come in, sell, get their supplies, go back again. And it's not like today when you've got 200 horse outboards and you're in and out in 2 hours. But you didn't have the health requirements then that you had today either. So it was different. Today, most of the local people have, had children. The children have moved on. There's not a lot of the locals that were there when I grew up are not there anymore. Most people have come down from up north and have bought the old houses and have settled in. It's not the close-knit community that it once was. Someone said one time that the difference between the local people and people that moved here is that local people liked you and trusted you until you proved them wrong. And the people that move here don't trust you unless you prove that you're trustworthy. And it's just a different philosophy. I'm not sure that's true, but it seems like it is. And, when I was a kid, everybody'd meet at the store in the morning and get a Coke and sit around the stove and tell stories and try to figure out whether they were going to go to work that day or not, depending on the tide and the weather. Today there is no meeting place. Some people, you'd see some people at the post office. And that's about it. It's a big change.
And how about the Willis Wharf you grew up in, which is quite different?
Yeah. I've also noticed a change in Willis Wharf from as a child. I rode my bike around but and there were, I would ride to the oyster house, or my dad used to work on the railway sometimes, and just go hang out and try to listen in on whatever was going on. It was busy, and there was a lot of, there's always somebody stopping by, and that has changed, but it's still busy. The wharf, the harbor is busy. Lots of fishermen still, lots of work boats. There aren't as many people that living in Willis Wharf, but I would say for me, there are still some. It still feels like home.
Work boats, and I know that when I was doing work down at Willis Wharf in the early 70s, is that the boat that everybody had was a scow, a Chincoteague scow. Mm-hmm. But there are other boats there, and all those scows seem to have been replaced with Carolina skiffs.
Or southern skimmers, that's true. When I was growing up, everybody had a large 30, 40-foot workboat. A lot of them bought the 671 diesels from the Navy after World War II, that's the engine that they developed for the landing crafts, and they were built to make one trip. But they turned out to be really reliable engines. They were first built by Gray, the Marine Grays, and they were bought. The patent was bought by General Motors, and so they're GM 671s, and they were dirty engines, a lot of oil. They were sloppy, and they couldn't pass the standards of engines today, but they lasted forever. And there was a great surplus of them after World War II, and just about everybody went over and bought a used 671 out of a landing craft. And we had, at one time, we had 6 different boats. My grandfather built the one that we used for dredging oysters, the Swansea. And in those days, when you planted oysters, you had to be very careful that you didn't have people come down during the night and relieve you of some of your oysters. So we had watchmen that stayed down full time, and we had to have a boat for them. Like I said, it was a slower time, and nobody had outboards. You just got in your boat and went down the bay, and you knew you were going to be there all day, so there was no great rush. Today, those boats are all gone. Everybody's using fiberglass. It's just a whole lot easier to maintain, and they're fast. Nobody wants to spend the day in the bay. They want to go get their work done and come in. Except me, maybe. But it's a whole different. It's a faster lifestyle than it was when I was a kid, for sure.
You mentioned the watch houses and the watch boats, and that there were people who would borrow your oysters on occasion.
On occasion.
Now I know that there are stories in there.
Yes.
Can you share one that speaks to being out there and dealing with a miscreant?
Well, there's a lot of stories. One, I used to go out on any time that I had time from school and stay on the watch boat with Captain George Saunders, and he was quite the guy. We'd anchor up somewhere, and if it was in the winter, we'd shoot some birds or eat clams and oysters, or in the summer we'd catch fish, and that was, Captain George liked salted fish a lot. So we'd catch the fish and clean them and gut them, and he'd drop them in a bucket of salt. And he never soaked them and cleaned the salt off. When he fried them, you'd pucker. I mean, I just couldn't eat them. But the story I think you want is the time that we had a problem with someone stealing oysters, and Uncle Buzz went out one night to watch the oysters, and he had a 30-06. He heard a noise, and it was a foggy night, very still, and so any noise he heard was was echoed across the water. It was magnified, and it just so happened that night that my dear friend Billy Boyne and his father were out stealing our oysters, and the guy who runs my operation now, Jack Smith's father and his brother, were also out stealing our oysters. Very close-knit community.
This is why I use the word borrow.
Well, borrowed because I guess, because we're so close-knit, everybody felt like, what's mine is yours. Uncle Buzz didn't feel that way. And so after he heard that noise again, he decided he would fire a couple of shots in that direction. The first shot took the brim off Billy Boyne's dad's hat. And you have to realize that this was in December, and it was cold. And Jack Smith's dad, Jack, said, he's crazy, jump overboard and get behind the boat. So they jumped overboard in freezing weather, and Uncle Buzz decided that maybe he better fire a couple more shots just to make sure that they understood he didn't want them on the ground, which he did. And they stayed overboard until they almost froze to death. And when they got up, they were afraid to come back into Willis's Wharf. So they poled their boats all the way to Oyster, which is about 5 miles south, and came ashore and didn't show back up in Willis Wharf for a week. And when they did show back up, they all met down at Johnson's store and laughed about the whole experience. And that was Willis Wharf.
I think that captures a lot of it. So, Heather, you've been out there and you've had your adventures. Is there one that you would share?
I don't think I can top that. I don't.
Well, it's not a competition.
No, I know. I don't. None of that sort of thing was really going on. I've been out, in a rainstorm or had some adventures, but I don't have any.
I don't think a lot
moment.
of people know about weather, how weather works out there and how quickly it changes. So you've been caught out there in weather.
Oh, yeah.
And you have one of those?
Yeah, well, we were out just last year, actually. We were putting over bags of clam seed while the tide was still up so that you don't have to tote them all. We were dropping them in the beds. And all of a sudden we looked up and there were 4 or 5 water spouts just randomly placed over the bay. But we were with Jack. Mm-hmm. And there was one that was, I would say it was getting uncomfortably close. It made for some cool video, but it was pretty wild to see. And so the weather can just be very unpredictable and it can pop up out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am told that we need to end, but I do have one last question.
Okay. Always.
When you were out there together, how do you feel about family and generations when it's the two of you working?
For me, I love to be out with my dad because I know that that's the place that he likes to be. And it means so much to him. So I feel extra connected to my dad when we're there together. And then in turn, that makes me feel connected to a long line of people, some of whom I know and some of whom I've never met. But it makes me feel very much a part of that history.
And Pete?
Well, you know, I think that my uncle thought more in terms of generations than he did in terms of a dollar today. And I think this is something that maybe I learned in Southeast Asia, that you have to think generational rather than by the 5-year plan or the 10-year plan. When Uncle Buzz had cancer, we were talking, he said, well, I've had a great life. He said, I've done a lot of things that I was proud of, but the one thing that I think I'm the most proud of is sending this company to the next generation. I feel the same way.
I share that feeling in our family with our family history. Pete, thank you so much for that. Heather, thank you.
Thank you, Bernie.
And I am so sad to draw our conversation to a close. I know there are many stories out there, some fit for audiences, some for a clam house that one day may reopen.
Exactly.
All right, thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.